Soulless Dead, Chapter 13, Maalal. As everything had begun to spin out of control in the battle, they told me that there were more people coming, and there were more people below the floor where we were standing. As I stood there, and the lieutenant told me that there was something down there that I wasn't going to like, thousands of things ran through my head. The pain was trivial, to be honest, and it was something that I'd grown accustomed to at this point. Yes, life is pain. What he began to tell me, I don't even remember because my eyes were just wide. I guess I was receiving the information, but I was ignoring it. It was just muffled, like on the Peanuts. Wah, 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 wah. I couldn't hear anything. My body reacted in shock. I removed my faceplate and my helmet, and I held it onto my side as I went limp in surprise. And sheer disgust and shock, I dropped it to the ground. As I was staring, my arm, I noticed, began to raise as I told people to move forward, and I motioned to them. The men formed up and got near the door to go to the bottom floor, and we then made our way down the steps. The air down there was much stinkier, much smellier. It reeked much more horribly of death and stink and waste. At first, it was like a blast of urine and old feces that had fermented into our face. We all covered our mouth. It was atrocious. Then we made our way down the steps, and rats would scurry by, and the sound of moaning and pain. A few of the bikers had made their way down the hallways and began to peek out and fire at us. We formed up against the walls and got down, and a few of our boys at the point took them out quite quickly. They would stagger backwards as their body would take the shock of the bullets to the chest, and they would lean back against the wall and slide down as the blood left a trail. A few of our boys would make their way forward and clear the area. We noticed a hallway full of doors that were bolted shut. We took the deadbolts off, and we took the chains away from the knobs and opened them to find survivors. Women and children, and even little kids, like little boys, chained up to their beds, malnourished and sick, covered in their own mess. Crying, they would begin to shudder as one arm was free. They would cover their faces as if they had been abused and punched. The shock as I stood in the hallway as men rushed by me, it seemed 1,000 miles an hour. I just stood there. I could hear them saying, "Ma'am, it's going to be okay. We're liberating you. You're going to be all right." And they would cry, and some of them would thank them. It was like watching a Holocaust video, like in high school when we were learning about it. At first they were scared that they were going to die, but then they would embrace us with a kiss as we'd cut the chains off of them. Their feeble bodies would be walked out of there and placed in the hallway where they would await to be transported to safe haven. Tears of fear and happiness and joy filled the air. The men were grabbing supplies as well from other closets and rooms that were chained up as well. The stench was so bad some of them would run out of the room quickly and vomit onto the floor violently as their body would lurch forward. I heard a few of them say in the background, "I've seen some shit before, but this is horrible." It's amazing how some of the most battle-hardened men can still crumble. A few of them with tears in their eyes as they helped them out of there. The little children, they were bruised and bloodied in places I really don't want to mention. They were covered in waste, and they were horribly disfigured, broken jaws, teeth were pulled out, they were tormented. Those rumors of the sex trade were real, and I can't imagine that people would do such evil things, evil deeds to people. Well, that's the world we live in. It's not the dead that do the most gruesome things, you see. It's the people that are left unchecked that do the worst things. The best people you could ever meet, the heroes of industry and of morality, can turn into the most disgusting people. But we see here that when the disgusting people are left unchecked, with not so much as a slap upon the wrist for the wrongdoing, they go wild and they allow horrible things like this to children, people that can't defend themselves at all. as I began to shake it off and began to snap back to reality where I was standing. The lieutenant that I had become close friends with stopped and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're going to want to see this." A few gunshots had cracked, and I sort of jumped, uncharacteristically at this point. We made our way to the very back of the hallway, sharp left and then a right, all the way at the end. We saw two bikers in the other room that had just freshly been shot. Two men were lighting up a cigarette, most likely to ease their stress. Smoke filled the air, as the two freshly dead bikers were laying there face first, butts in the air, as they were bent down and shot quite quickly. I looked in and saw that the barred windows allowed some light to shine upon them. My men stood in the shadows as their guns were smoking and shell casings were clanking on the ground. It was as if that the sinfulness of man was to be ignored, and that it was some sort of release for them. It seemed as though fortune had shined on the men that had caused all this horrible stuff, the men that were guarding the very thing they knew that they were doing. Yet my men were forgotten. The lieutenant said, "Sir, we need to move on." I snapped back again. I walked my way into the room. I had noticed that the door was slightly ajar, and he said, "Sir, here's a rag," and he handed it to me, and I placed it over my mouth. He said, "You're not going to like what you see." We opened the door, and the stench was horrific. That small crack wasn't doing it justice, and the smell had hit us like a wave. My head cocked back, and I gagged, and I puked all over myself, and all over the wall. As I was bent over, I began to spit the rest of the disgusting flavor that had left in my mouth. Leaning over, didn't even get to see what it was. The smell was so atrocious. Violent, my eyes were watering. Mucus was running out of my nose and out of my mouth. I collected myself and wiped myself off the best I could, and I made my way in. What I saw, my hand began to shake again. I began to see all the horrible things that I did. I dropped my rifle to the ground. It was covered in bugs and filth and rats and all other dead things. The stench was from two children. There were two wireframe beds. They were chained to it, and they were dead. The doctor had walked next to me and briefly slid on the filth of the floor, and the dead animals that had been tamped into the ground. He went over to the children and placed his fingers upon their jugular vein to check their pulses, and they were gone. Long gone. They were blue and bloated. Between the heat, the lack of ventilation, they'd begun to rot, with looks of shock on their eyes. They were children, a little boy and a little girl. They were stripped of their clothes and bruised and beaten. God knows what else they did to them. This stuff happened before all this happened. But now I get to see it. My lip quivered. My breath, it was stuttered. The disgust and the anger. I looked down and I saw that the beds were attached to car batteries. They tormented them to death. Pliers and an empty dish for surgery filled with teeth. It was the most nightmarish thing I've ever seen. It was hell on earth. What kind of sick bastard would do this to children? Why? They were supposed to be our future, our faith, and now they're sitting here, rotting, forgotten. Somebody's children. Were their parents shot? These children will never know happiness again because they're dead. Maybe they are freed. I don't know. Along with the doctor taking the daughter, he closed her eyes and unchained her and pulled her out and laid her in the hallway with a sheet over her and told the boys to pull her away. I went over to the little boy. I closed his eyes with my fingers. I squatted down against the wall and began to bawl, hand in my face, sweat running down my long hair. cried violently. The men standing post at the door left and shut the door. The light was shining through the window, and the boy, after his eyes were closed, looked slightly peaceful. There was more peace in his body. I looked at the window and threw a rock through the glass, just through the bars, and asked him, "Is this what you want? If there's somebody out there, listen. What is it that you want from us? Why is this happening? Why is this little boy like this? What made this occur?" Bawling my eyes out, I asked why. Why did I see this? Why did this happen? And I stumbled and I fell against the other bed across from him. Lieutenant broke in and said we had to go. The other two men that were posted as guards came in and wrapped a sheet in him and took him out of the room. I wiped the tears from my eyes, bloodshot, hives breaking out of my skin. Confused, short of breath, he helped me up. What the hell am I doing here? My breathing began to get deeper and I calmed myself. And then I could feel a burning down in my gut, making its way up to my chest and up my throat, into my face and into my head. It was like someone poured a gallon of acid down into my skull. I pushed the commander out of the way and he slipped on the ground and hit the floor. I grabbed my rifle and made my way upstairs. One of the men told me to stop and slow down, and I bashed him in the face with my helmet. He fell to the floor with a broken nose. He yelled, "What the hell?" And I made my way past him and I ran up the hallway, up the stairs. My arm was bleeding, my heart was thumping, my leg was burning, and everything in me was angry. I pushed my way through the steel doors that were holding that smell back, and all the men were like, "What the hell happened?" I made my way over, and I looked at the men, and I paced back and forth, snarling and sneering, looking at all of them back and forth, and they were looking at me in shock. I told the men to raise their heads and pull their heads back. Reluctantly, they all got together and did. I grabbed my knife and slit every one of their throats. I grabbed the young one by the hair and just stared at him and screamed as loud as I could into his face. He was gagging and gurgling the blood he was spitting up into my eyes. I continued to look at him. It was just like watching fluid drain from him. His face began to get weaker, just like that woman. His gurgling got quieter and quieter. I held him up just by his hair. And he sat there, and I glared at him. My screaming stopped. I was biting a hole through my lip, glaring at him again. Intensely, he hiccuped once or twice, and then went limp. The last thing he ever saw was me, and the other men were laying on the ground, gagging and gasping for air. I threw the young man to the ground by his head, and I went over to one that was still alive, and I began to stomp him and kick him, yelling and grunting and angry. One of the commanders had came over and tried to grab me, and I pushed him off of me, and I began to stomp more and more and more and more. I was so angry, I was so intense. I fell to the ground, I began to bawl, I didn't know what to do. I laid there trying to console myself up, and people were grabbing me. One of the commanders had came over and cuffed me and placed me in the back of a truck. Everything was so frantic, my mind was losing it. The kids, the war, the hate. I noticed Derek was standing there, with a rifle in his hand, looking at me. The whole time he was there, somebody I knew, the one person that still had faith in me. I turned my head slowly and looked at him, and our eyes met. His head was slowly nodding back and forth in disgust, and the truck began to creak forward. It got further and further away. The men didn't say a thing on the way there. Made our way home, and They took me into a building and posted guards, and they took the handcuffs off me, and they sat me in a chair. They put a light on me and gave me a cup of water and locked the door. The whole room was dark. One light, some flies flying around it. I just sat there with an emotionless expression. Blood still caked on my face. Scars. I briefly glanced over at my arm and it was bleeding. My arm had begun to go limp. The pain was intense, but I didn't have it in me to moan or groan. I just sat there staring at the ground, staring into nothingness. And then I said to myself, Ra, Maalal. It meant evil deeds in Hebrew.